War Stories, Military Service, and American Society. Good evening. Thank you to my colleagues for the kind introduction, and thank you to the audience for being here tonight. My name is Bill Taylor. I'm an Associate Professor of Security Studies here at Angelo State University, or ASU. I've been asked to talk for the next 20 to 25 minutes about the nexus between ASU's War Stories project and my own work, most of which focuses on the vital linkages between military service and American society. In my first two books, Every Citizen a Soldier in 2014 and Military Service and American Democracy in 2016, I explore these connections and examine military service at the national level. In contrast, the War Stories Project allowed me insights into how West Texans experience military service, both collectively and individually. As a result, these war stories provide a rich tapestry that reveals a great deal about how various participants in the War Stories Project experience military service. I've chosen 4 representative examples spanning World War II to the present, including the accounts of Antonio Alderete Tafolla in World War II, Ken Daniel in the Vietnam War, Michael Gonzalez Jr. after the Persian Gulf War, and Carl McCoy during Operation Iraqi Freedom. These war stories are only a fraction of the vast repository of war stories that my colleagues here at ASU have collected, recorded, and made available for public use. It is my hope that in doing so, I might illustrate the value of the War Stories Project for both my own work on military service and as a potential for others in their own research. As I researched in the War Stories material, I was struck by the power, depth, and uniqueness of the various stories and the many insights that they revealed about the dynamic nature of military service in the 20th century. These are their stories. In his War Stories contribution, Bill Collier asked a searing question. Quote, he snores in the next room and you think you know him. He is your father, your father-in-law, your grandfather. He is a carpenter, a businessman, a clerk. His life seems almost as familiar as your own. Selfishly, you measure him with the yardstick of your own experience. What do you really know about him? End quote. Collier is referring to Antonio Alderete Tafolla, his father-in-law. Antonio and his 9 siblings lost their own father when Antonio was only 6 years old. In 1938, Tony, as he liked to be called, left San Angelo for Globe, Arizona, to work with the Civilian Conservation Corps, one of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs meant to provide jobs, working on infrastructure projects across the nation, and living in what contemporary observers colloquially refer to as CCC camps. Quote, the pay wasn't much, Tony lamented. He kept $8 a month and sent $22 home, but the meals were regular. He picked up a little extra money boxing, end quote. With regular jobs a scarcity in an America recovering from the Great Depression, Tony joined the Army on February 5th, 1940. Assigned to F Company, 2nd Battalion, 31st Infantry Regiment in Luzon, the Philippines, Tony and his comrades started what they hoped would be, quote, easy duty, end quote, in the South Pacific. With the Japanese assault on Pearl Harbor 10 months later, easy duty would transform into a life and death struggle for Tony and those with him on Luzon. Tony recalled, quote, from the outset, it was understood that the Philippines would have to fall. The damage to the American fleet at Pearl Harbor made adequate resupply or reinforcements impossible, end quote. When Japanese forces landed on Luzon on December 10th, 1941, the badly outnumbered, inadequately supplied, and completely surrounded U.S. personnel on Luzon, including Tony, were forced onto Bataan Peninsula. Quote, horses, mules, iguanas, and monkeys supplemented a meager rice diet, end quote, Tony recalled. In addition, malaria raged throughout the weakened American and Filipino ranks. During the intense fighting, much of it occurring in pitch blackness at night, Tony manned a .30 caliber machine gun. Japanese soldiers fired on Tony, striking him 7 times in the right collarbone and shoulder. But another bullet went through his helmet, spinning it around, but miraculously missing his head somehow, end quote. Illustrating the desperate position that Tony, his fellow soldiers on Bataan, and indeed the overall American predicament at that time in World War II, Tony received only 2 weeks of medical attention at Corregidor for his serious wounds, after which, quote, his shoulder, still carrying 5 bullets and pieces of others, an open wound that could and did become quickly infected, he was sent back to his unit on Bataan, end quote. Having not yet recovered from his previous substantial injuries, Tony was wounded again, this time because a grenade exploded near him, riddling his legs and knees with shrapnel. When Major General Edward King Jr. surrendered his beleaguered command of 76,000 American soldiers, Tony became a prisoner of war. Upon his capture, a daring nighttime escape allowed Tony to find his way toward Corregidor, aided by a U.S. patrol boat that serendipitously arrived to save the escapees from harassing fire from Japanese Zero fighters circling overhead. Once on Corregidor, Tony and his fellow soldiers fought valiantly to hold the island fortress, but the overwhelming numbers and firepower of the surrounding Japanese forces proved too much. Major General Jonathan Wainwright surrendered Corregidor and the 13,000 men on it on May 6, 1942. Having escaped initial captivity and afterwards survived the Bataan Death March, Tony was once again a prisoner of war. Spending more than another full year as a prisoner of war, Tony experienced the harshest treatment imaginable. Quote, there was the hose torture, for example. Guards shoved a water hose down the throat of a prisoner and turned on the tap. If the prisoner didn't drink fast enough, he drowned. There were the beatings. Beatings for doing something wrong and beatings for doing it right. Beatings for each Japanese battle defeat and beatings for each Japanese victory, end quote. The effects of such abuse were obvious and telling. Tony weighed less than 90 pounds as a result of the mistreatment. In the midst of such an ordeal, Tony found ways to cope. Quote, he pretended to be crazy. So convincing was his performance that the Japanese left him completely alone, believing him to be touched by the gods, end quote. After being sent in 1944 to mainland Japan as a prisoner of war, Tony endured another year as a prisoner of war before the fighting ceased, and on September 15, 1945, Allied forces liberated Tony's prisoner of war camp. Quote, the war was over for Tony, but the effects still lingered. He fought recurring malaria until around 1957, had to live another bullet fragment removed around 1955, suffered severe headaches and pains in his wounds, and is troubled periodically with severe ulcers, which led to a long hospital stay in 1970. But he counts himself one of the lucky ones. Only about 69 men of the 183 in his original company in the 31st Infantry ever made it back home, end quote. Ken Daniel, U.S. Army retired, recounted events surrounding the receipt of his Purple Heart Award, this nation's decoration given to those wounded or killed while serving in the military and situated just junior to the Bronze Star Medal. Daniel characterized his military service in Vietnam in simple terms. Quote, almost like Caesar, I came, I saw, and I got shot with an 82 millimeter mortar, end quote. Daniel and his lieutenant were on a secret mission to rig a contraption that fed off the artillery's generator so that they could supply light inside their own bunker. While the pair worked in close coordination with the lieutenant, quote, readying the light fixture we had stolen, end quote, and Daniel splicing into their power line, 20 enemy mortar rounds landed on their fire base. One round struck Daniel's right shoulder. In the casual bluntness of a combat soldier, Daniel remarked, quote, "I stumbled into the bunker and told my lieutenant I hope he was happy. His Yankee Republican war just got me shot," end quote. When a medic dutifully pronounced Daniel dead because he could not find his pulse, his lieutenant, quote, laughed and said I was most certainly alive because I was razzing him about the war, end quote. Having clarified his status, medics quickly transported him to a helicopter where Daniel informed them of his home address in Tacoma, Washington. Instead of taking Daniel there as he requested, they opted to transport him to a military medical hospital where several days later, quote, "some major pinned my Purple Heart on my pillow and I promptly grew up on it," end quote. Kenneth, as he preferred to be called rather than Sergeant Daniel, recalled some positives of his injury. For one, he was, quote, "promised any meal I wanted when I woke up. I asked for steak, chocolate ice cream, and cake," end quote. Unfortunately, according to Daniel, quote, "when I came to, the steak was cold and the ice cream completely melted," end quote. Michael Gonzalez Jr., Mineman, Chief Petty Officer of Surface Warfare, U.S. Navy, retired, recounted the harrowing incidents surrounding what he termed, quote, "the Norfolk incident," end quote. Gonzalez narrated, quote, "we were casting off for open seas again, and odd as it might seem, I had learned to both love and hate those words. The varied emotions that stirred within me, as with each man aboard the USS Warrior, were a mix of anxiety, dread, and uncertainty," end quote. Gonzalez's Delta crew had a prominent and proud history. They had recently rescued a fishing vessel in the Gulf of Mexico, aided the USS Dexterous in the Persian Gulf, and recovered 2 cruise missiles after the Persian Gulf War from 1990 to 1991. Assuming that its ship's voyage from Ingleside, Texas to Annapolis, Maryland to represent the fleet at the Navy versus Rice collegiate football game would be a routine one, Gonzalez learned that when in the Navy, one, quote, "never says never," end quote. In international waters near Norfolk, Virginia, their crews took a menacing turn. During a routine general quarters drill, a small boat approached the Warrior's port side. Because the lesser vessel was roughly 2,000 yards away from the much larger warship, nothing seemed amiss. Events, however, quickly became tense as the small craft began darting toward the U.S. Navy warship at a high rate of speed and refused to respond to numerous warnings from the Warrior's executive officer. As the small boat approached 1,500 yards, the Warrior's crew readied its weapons. The memory of the USS Cole was not far from the crew's minds. 1 year prior, the USS Cole, a U.S. Navy destroyer, had stopped in Aden, Yemen for routine refueling. During the mundane visit, a small craft approached the warship and detonated a large explosive device, ripping a 40 by 60 foot hole in the warship and killing 17 American soldiers and wounding 39 others. The Warrior's crew wondered whether a similar fate now awaited them off the coast of Virginia. At 1,000 yards, the Warrior's crew loaded its weapons. Gonzalez dreaded, quote, "nowhere in my wildest dreams would I ever expect such a thing to happen. Surely this pleasure craft would heed the warning and turn away. We were in the USA, for heaven's sake," end quote. He despaired, quote, "we don't shoot private pleasure crafts out of the water, do we?" end quote. Unsure of the intentions of the minor, yet worrying craft and anxious because of its repeated disregard of the warship's warnings, the Warrior's crew readied their weapons to the highest level, threateningly labeled Code Red, readying to fire upon the defiant craft. As the warship's executive officer uttered his last desperate warning for the small craft to turn away, the lesser vessel finally realized the danger that it was in and veered off, averting crisis at the last moment. Gonzalez estimated, quote, "we could see the vacationers on board looking at us in horror as they soon realized that their frivolous sightseeing venture had become a serious breach of protocol which almost cost them their lives, end quote. Carl McCoy served in the Iraq War as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom. McCoy was born in Amarillo, Texas, and grew up in the Texas Panhandle, a region that McCoy described as being largely pro-military. Quote, but what I found is the majority of West Texans are about the military, our country, where it's headed, what we can do to fix problems, and take care of business, end quote. McCoy first joined the U.S. Marine Corps, serving in that branch from 1989 to 1996. He then served in the Oklahoma National Guard for 2 years, and then in the U.S. Army, all with infantry units as a non-commissioned officer, or NCO. McCoy came from a long line of military members in his family. As a result, McCoy conceded, quote, so I felt that needed to be my duty, number one, end quote. Of course, practical concerns also played a part. Quote, number two, I didn't have any problem with the educational benefits because that's how I wound up getting my degree, end quote. McCoy served overseas in Iraq as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom from March 2003 to April 2004. His task was simple. Quote, and the mission was fairly clear-cut because we were the invasion force, part of the invasion force, going into Iraq to take that country. As far as the mission, we had no idea how it was going to turn out, end quote. Events would prove McCoy quite prescient, as the invasion of Iraq proceeded fairly quickly, albeit not without resistance and casualties. What would follow, however, evolved into chaos. A major insurgency against the fledgling Iraqi government, large-scale looting in many cities, massive outages of such basic social services as electricity, food, water, and markets, and widespread sectarian violence pitting Sunni against Shia Muslims and vice versa. McCoy admitted that, quote, the complications that we had when we were over there were astronomical. It was just constant dynamics on a daily basis. And so the mission, I really can't define it because it changed every day, end quote. As an ammunition explosive expert, McCoy accompanied a range of military units, including infantry, military police, intelligence, and special forces. Quote, and I went from what I thought my mission was going to be in this war to now I'm out here with a bunch of door kickers, raiding houses, and taking bad guys down. That's just what we did, end quote. While in Iraq, McCoy served in direct combat, and while not wounded in action, he did suffer an injury. Quote, I had a tank round dropped on me one time, tore my rotator cuff in my shoulder, crushed a disc in my back. Got some problems with my knees just from pumping heavy loads and whatnot. So I didn't get shot directly by the enemy, but yeah, I got wounded, end quote. When asked to describe his most vivid memories of his time in military service, McCoy explained, quote, I'll leave it at this. Some of the best times of my life and some of the worst times of my life. Those of us that made it back, I still have a lifelong bond with them. But then there's those that didn't, end quote. Indeed, the war stories of Antonio Alderete Tafolla, Ken Daniel, Michael Gonzalez Jr., and Carl McCoy are four compelling examples of the varieties and broad spectrum of experiences amassed, documented, and deposited in the immense assortment of war stories that my colleagues here at ASU have collected, recorded, and made available for public use. The war stories present an intimate portrait of four West Texans and their unique experiences with military service in a broad range of encounters. Whether it was the harrowing suffering of a World War II prisoner of war, the gritty wounding yet playful banter of a combat veteran during the Vietnam War, the surprise changeover from a peacetime transit to a Navy football game, to readying weapons for war in the aftermath of the Persian Gulf War, or the difficult and unanticipated evolution from the invasion of Iraq to the complex counterinsurgency that followed, these war stories provide us critical insights into how West Texans, individually and collectively, experience military service during peace, war, and the sometimes ambiguous area in between. These stories, however, are just the beginning. There are numerous more war stories like these that my colleagues have meticulously gathered and recorded as part of the War Stories Project. As a collection, they present a wonderful, varied, and excellent venue for additional research by current and future generations. Together, these war stories archive a plethora of unique experiences that West Texans have had in military service, during peace, war, and everything in between. From my work, these war stories have reminded me that while national trends are critical to understanding military service, individual war stories add depth and nuance to broad overviews. They present a window into how individuals, in this case, West Texans, experience military service and how it impacted them, both during their time in the military and long afterwards. Such insights impart richness to depictions of military service and present a useful reminder that military service is not a monolithic endeavor, but rather a tapestry woven together by numerous war stories, each one containing their own individual thread, but yet contributing to the broader strands. Such an approach is just one example of the great value that the War Stories collections presents to scholars, students, and community members alike. I encourage anyone interested in the palpable linkages between war stories, military service, and American society to explore these documents and use them in their own work. I'm confident that there is much value to be found. Thank you again for your time and best wishes as you explore the War Stories collections.